All right, Algebra 2. Um, I cannot be here today. I am out of town today, and we've got some graphing to do, sine and cosine. So last class, we took the unit circle and we rolled it out into a basic sine curve and cosine curve. Remember, those equations that we did were y equals the sine of x, right? And we also did y equals the cosine of x. Well, we know that the equation for sine and cosine graphs are y equals a sine or cosine. So sine b x minus c plus d, right? That is the general form for a trigonometric function. So what we've said is that for this year, b will equal 1, okay? And we will not do a horizontal shift, okay? So we have equations like this, where the first thing you want to do is you want to list A, B, C, D. Now we know that B is going to equal 1, right? And it does because it's right there. It is an implied 1. A equals 2. C is going to equal 0. So these things are going to be true this year. And D equals -3. So as in every function, the first thing you want to do is identify your, your constants. And when we did the ones yesterday, A was 1, the amplitude was 1, B was 1, C and D were 0. A was 1, B was 1, C and D were 0. Okay, so this is the parent, right? But then things change. And today we're going to learn how to graph an equation. So first thing we do is state the amplitude. If A is 2, then the amplitude is the absolute value of A, right? So in this case, the absolute value of 2 is 2. Next, we state the period. Now, the period as a definition, okay, I'm going to put it up here, is the formula 2 pi divided by B. So that is the period. And what we've said is that this year, we're only going to deal with B equals 1. Okay, so remember the period is the length of one full cycle. Okay, so it's going to take from 0 to 2 pi right here to go one full cycle. And so whatever, we have a sine curve. So this graph is going to go do a whole sine curve in 2 pi. Okay? All right. So next. So we need to create a table for this graph. So what we want to do is we want to start with a value is going to be the C value. Well, in our case, C is going to be 0. Because then we've said these two things are going to be constant this year. So C is 0. But then we need this count by, or I like to call it interval. Interval between what? The interval between our X values. From C to the next value, what do we count by? Because we need 5 key points, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So how do I count along the x-axis? Okay, and we divide the period by 4. So we're going to take 2 pi, the period, divide it by 4, and that simplifies, right, to pi over 2. So our count by number is going to be pi over 2. Now, because we're going to keep B constant this year, that our count by is always going to be pi over 2. 2 pi divided into 4 equal intervals. So 0 plus pi over 2 is pi over 2. Pi over 2 plus pi over 2 equals pi. Now let's do that with a fraction. If I have pi over 2 plus pi over 2, right, that becomes, it's just a fraction, right? It's a common denominator 2. You add the numerators. 1 pi plus 1 pi is 2 pi. But the 2's cancel, and that's where I'm getting the pi from. Okay, so now, excuse me, if I had 2 pi over 2 and I wanted to get my next x value, I add the interval. This is the interval or the count by. So I have 2 pi over 2. So I add another pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, or pi, plus pi over 2, gives me 3 pi over 2. And then I want to add another interval. So 3 pi over 2 plus 1 pi over 2 is 4 pi over 2, right? Which is 2 pi. So the way I start my table at C, I add the interval or the count by, and we amount, and we keep adding pi over 2 plus, and we keep adding pi over 2, and we keep adding pi over 2. Now we have our x values. How do we get our y values? Well, first of all, I need to know where I'm starting from. I need the midline. Okay, because if I want to count amplitude up and down, I need to know where to start. So we start at the midline. Remember, let's put a D here, right? Midline is the D value. So D is -3. So that is the midline always. Y equals -3. And I'm going to go graph that right now. So let's go down to here and we're going to graph the midline. Y equals -3. Okay, so the next thing I want to do for my y values is get the 5 key points. What is the pattern? Well, the sine, a positive sine curve, if you'll remember from your notes yesterday, let's list the pattern. Sine starts at the interval, then it goes to the maximum, then it goes to the interval again, right? Comes back down, then it goes to the minimum, then it goes and it finishes up at the interval. Now, these intervals, circle them. They are the midline of my graph. So at this spot and this spot and this spot, right? That's the interval, the midline. So let's put D there. So D is -3. So I'm at the midline, at the midline, at the midline. Now, with my sine pattern, I go up to the max, go back to the interval, down to the minimum. So I need the maximum value and the minimum value. So how do I get the max and the minimum? I add the amplitude, right? I'm here and I'm going to add the amplitude. So the amplitude is 2. So -3 plus 2 is -1. Okay. And then I'm going to come down to the minimum. So I take -3 and I subtract 2. And that's going to be -5. Okay. So now I've got my y values and we're just going to plot points x, y, x, y, x, y. Here we go. Expecting a positive sign pattern. So 0, -3. X is 0, y is -3. That is a, right, that's at the midline. Now the next point is pi over 2, -1. So I go over pi over 2 down to -1. And then pi, -3. Over to pi, down to -3, back to the midline. And then 3 pi over 2, -5, go over to 3 pi over 2 on the x, down to -5. And then the last point of my 5 critical points is 2 pi, -3. Go over to 2 pi, down to -3. So let's, with a soft curve, gonna draw in our positive sine curve. Let's write the equation. It's y equals, we're just copying it from up here, amplitude of 2, the sine of x, b is 1, minus 3. So we see a midline of -3, and we have an amplitude here, right? amplitude equals 2, the absolute value of A. Okay? Now, let's draw another curve, remembering that this graph continues going, right? Because the domain is all real numbers. So my next point would be here, and then I'd come back to the midline, and then I'd go down to the minimum, and I'd come back to the midline. So dotted line, okay? I could continue this graph on, and that would be 2 cycles. All right, so that's graphing, and it's this step-by-step process. Let's do it again. So I want to graph the next graph, which is a negative cosine graph. So this is our process. First, A, B, C, D. We know that B is going to be 1 and C is going to be 0. Now let's look for A. A is negative 1. This is a negative cosine, which will affect the pattern. D is positive 2. So D is the midline. So let's write it right now. Let's do that first. Y equals positive 2. And that's the midline. I can literally go over and graph it right away. The midline. There's going to be the middle of my graph. Okay? Now, amplitude. Okay, well, amplitude has to do with A. So the amplitude is the absolute value of A, which equals 1. Which means the max will be added to the midline, 1. The minimum value will be subtracted from the midline. The period, remember, 2 pi over B, which equals 2 pi, right? The period's going to be 2 pi. So we're going to have 1 full cycle in 2 pi. And then the count by is the period divided by 4, which is pi over 2. Reduces, right? Okay, so table, we start with the x's. We always start our table at C, right, which is 0. Now we're going to count by pi over 2. 0 plus pi over 2. Pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is pi. Pi plus pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2, 1.5, plus pi over 2 is 2 pi. Now, we need a pattern. I like to write the pattern because now I have, let's write it up here, we have a negative cosine. So what is the pattern for a negative cosine? Let's write out the pattern. Well, cosine either starts, because it's a cosine, it's going to start at a max or a min. Because it's a negative cosine, it starts at the minimum value. So let's do our midlines first so we can get those. Now we know that there are only 2 intercepts that hit the midline. So my midline is 2. So let's put a 2 here and a 2 here. Okay? Because our pattern starts with, let's write the pattern, starts with the minimum, goes to the interval or the midline, then goes up to the maximum, comes back to the intercept, and then ends at the minimum. So intercept. This is a negative cosine, min, intercept max, intercept min. So there's my midline. My minimum is going to subtract the amplitude. Let's write that down in our notes. How do we go to the minimum? We subtract the amplitude value. So 2 minus 1 equals 1. That's going to be the minimum values. The maximum, what do? We add the amplitude. So 2 plus 1 is 3. Okay, and that's what we did here. We had a midline of -3, and we added the amplitude. For the minimum, we subtracted the amplitude of 2. Okay, so now we've got our y values, and we're going to plot them. 0, 1, 0, 1. Move over. Pi over 2, 2. We go to pi over 2, 2. pi 3, pi 3. 3 pi over 2, 2. 2 pi 1. And we connect this with a nice soft curve. Now, let's dotted line continue it on a little bit, because we know that in both directions, right, it would just continue the pattern, right? It would come back up to the midline, go up to the max, it'd continue going. Okay. All right. So we're going to we need practice with this, right? This is just a lot of process and a lot of details. So follow your process, and I will see you next week. Maybe.